Welcome to Festival of Ideas Online. I'm Andrew Kelly, Director of Festival of Ideas. Michael Sandel teaches political philosophy at Harvard. His recent books have become international bestsellers and include What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, and Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do? His new book, which we're discussing today, is The Tyranny of Merit, What's Become of the Common Good. This event is part of a series we're running on the future of democracy. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Michael, for being with us today.
Thank you, Michael, Andrew. It's a pleasure.
Michael, can we start with the concept of the common good? What do you mean by the common good?
Well, there are two ways of thinking about it. One is to think of the common good as just adding up our preferences as individuals or as consumers. And that's an aggregative idea of the common good. A richer, deeper idea of the common good is something we strive for together, deliberating as citizens about the purposes and ends worthy of our political community, worthy of us. And it's the second notion of the common good that is largely lost from view these days in the rancorous, polarized politics that we have. And so the question that motivates the book really is, what has become of the common good? Why do we have such a deeply polarized politics? And what would it take to emerge from this condition?
And we're going to be going through some of these points as we go through. But I wanted to just ask you about, one of the things that right from the start is about how there's been this shift in things like the concept of the common good, particularly in the last 4 decades. What's been behind that, and what came before? Was there a kind of golden age of the common good?
I don't think there's ever been a golden age of the common good, but I think there are historical moments when we are pulling together, when we have a keener sense that we are all in this together, and other times when we are more fractious, more polarized. I think the last 4 decades have been an important turning point in this respect. They have been decades governed by a kind of market faith, one might even say a market triumphalist faith, the belief that markets and market mechanisms are the primary instruments for defining and achieving the common good. And this has a lot to do with the market-driven version of globalization that was embraced by mainstream parties across the political spectrum since the 1980s. And I think the effect of this 4-decade period, roughly speaking, has been to entrench consumerist, market-driven notions of what the common good means. And I think that's driven out a more expansive, more generous, more civic conception of the common good. And it's that second civic conception of the common good that I'm trying to prompt us to reconsider.
Now, at the center of the book is the concept of meritocracy and
yes,
the problems with that term. And in periods of inequality, and particularly gross inequality that we're living through now, governments and elites talk about equality of opportunity and the merits of meritocracy. And although it's a relatively recent term coined by Michael Young in Britain in the late 50s, the idea of meritocracy has been around for a long time, hasn't it?
Well, it has. It's interesting that when Michael Young coined the term in the late 50s, in a short book called The Rise of the Meritocracy, he was not setting it out as an ideal, something we should aspire to. His account was a dystopian scenario about the meritocracy, because he thought that the meritocracy would carry with it attitudes towards success that would lead those on top to believe they deserved their place, and that those on the bottom deserved their place as well. So he worried about meritocracy when he invented the term. And what's striking is that in the years since Michael Young coined the term, meritocracy has been used by politicians of the center left and center right as an ideal, as something to aim at. We heard this from politicians ranging from Tony Blair to Theresa May explicitly. What we want is a meritocracy. Now, what they meant by that was a more fair society, less where one's chances in life were determined less by the class into which one was born and more on one's own effort and talents. That was what they meant. And so it's understandable why they took this to be a kind of ideal, a way to a more fair society. But as I point out in the book, Michael Young was onto something. There is a dark side to meritocracy, though it seems on the surface to be about fairness, about overcoming the disadvantages associated with birth or background. And the dark side has to do with the attitudes that go with the meritocratic idea of success. The attitudes that if I really have competed on a level playing field, then I must have earned my place if I succeed, if I land on top, through my own efforts and talents. And by implication, those who lose out, those who struggle, must lack the effort and talents to rise, insofar as everyone has an equal chance. So it's these ungenerous attitudes toward success, one might say, that represent the dark side of meritocracy. And I think, so it's not only the inequality that has deepened in recent decades, it's the attitudes toward success that have accompanied that deepening inequality that have driven us apart, that have led those on top to look down on those less accomplished, less credentialed than themselves, and that have led to a deep resentment among those who have not flourished in the new economy.
Now, Young himself, I think, was very worried about the way it was being used, and I think pleaded with Tony Blair not to use it, really, to stop using it.
He did. He wrote a piece, Michael Young did, late in life in The Guardian, noticing and bemoaning the fact that Tony Blair had really used the idea of meritocracy, Michael Young's idea, to describe his vision for the future of Britain. And Young pleaded with Blair to either stop using the term or at least to recognize the downside. And the downside has to do with this demoralizing, even for some humiliating effect, that if one doesn't rise in a meritocratic society, one is relegated to less respect, less recognition, less social esteem. It's interesting, Andrew, if I could just add, toward the end of his book, Michael Young predicted, now this was a kind of historical fiction, Michael Young's book was, he predicted that the resentments of those left behind would become so grievous over time that by the year 2034, this is Michael Young, there would be a populist revolt against meritocratic elites. Well, he was right, except that revolt, that populist backlash, came about 18 years early, in 2016, when we saw with Brexit and with the election of Trump, the resentment of working people against meritocratic elites found rather severe political expression.
I'm going to come back to that and talk about politics and democracy and populism, yeah. But I'm very struck by the way that meritocracy is a problem and the way you describe it. But it's also, it's also a problem for some of those who get to the top as well, in terms of and we'll come on to education in a moment, but the anxiety and the stress and the search for perfectionism and so on can also have an impact, can't it?
Right. As I point out in the book, the tyranny of merit points in two directions at once. The tyranny is exerted on those who lose out in a meritocratic society, and in particular, those who have lost out over the past 4 decades of market-driven globalization. But the tyranny of merit also afflicts the winners in subtle but increasingly devastating ways. Because, as many have pointed out, the winners, the successful in a meritocratic society, are able to pass their advantages onto their children. Now, this is supposed to be the characteristic of an aristocratic society where the children inherit the land, the estate, the wealth. And part of the appeal of a meritocratic society is that each generation begins anew. If everyone has a truly equal chance to rise, then in principle, in a meritocratic society, there is no inheritance of advantage or of privilege. But of course, we know that's not the case. We know that well-educated, well-off parents are able to give their children a leg up in the competitive meritocratic race. And the primary instrument of this is to prepare them and to equip them with quite a bit of rigor and severity for success in the competition to get into elite schools, colleges, and universities. So, for example, in speaking now of the American case, in Ivy League universities in the US, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, places like that, there are more students from the top 1% than from the entire bottom half of the country combined. And this is even with very generous scholarship schemes and financial aid policies. Now, so one might think, well, how does the tyranny of merit afflict the winners? In order to equip and prepare young people for the rigors of meritocratic competition, affluent parents have essentially turned the teenage years of their children, sometimes beginning earlier, into a very stressful, anxiety-ridden, competitive preparation for the tournament to be admitted to elite universities. And this takes a toll, a psychic toll, an emotional toll on this generation of young people. I see it in my students. The surveys have been done about the mental health struggles of many college-age young people. And it's really an alarming, that we see an alarming result. In the US, the figures are that about 30% and upwards of students in colleges and universities suffer from anxiety, suffer from depression. Studies in the UK and in North America have shown an epidemic of perfectionism, the sense that the ultimate measure of oneself is achievement. Who you are is what you achieve. This takes a devastating toll on parent-child relations and on the mental health and the emotional welfare of young people. And here I'm talking about the winners. So the tyranny of merit does not leave even the successful and their children unscathed. All the more reason to think again about whether that's the way we want to organize our society.
And the other point about is the value that's given to a degree, and nowadays, but yet most Americans don't have a college degree, in fact, do they?
It's true. It's very interesting. We put such great value in employment, but also in social esteem, on having a four-year college degree. And the majority of Americans and Britons and Europeans, the majority do not have four-year college degrees. So, in fact, I think it's the case that none or almost none of the Western democratic societies do a majority of people even have a four-year college degree. So designing an economy that presupposes, as a condition of dignified work and a decent life, a university diploma, that is a recipe for disappointment and for resentment. We see this also reflected in political representation, where to be a member of parliament in Britain or the US Congress, or to be a member of the parliaments of the European countries, it's almost become an informal prerequisite to have a four-year college degree. Overwhelmingly, MPs in Western democracies have four-year college degrees. Now, one might say, well, isn't that a good thing? Don't we want well-educated political representatives? Well, yes, up to a point, but the price we pay, essentially, is to empty parliaments of working-class citizens, which really narrows the scope of representative government and of democratic deliberation. And we've done this out of the desire to put greater and greater weight on getting a university diploma. But it has had these really damaging effects for not only the social esteem accorded working people, but also political representation itself.
I thought it was very interesting in the book. I was reading your book just after I'd read a new biography of Ernest Bevin, who you mention in the book. And Bevin did a lot of his early work in Bristol, where we're from, and was a trade unionist, a working class man who went to learn through university extension courses and what we would call workers' educational association type event. And you, when I read that, I thought, I can't picture a contemporary politician having a similar background to that through that time, really.
Exactly. That's a very telling example. In Attlee's cabinet, there were, I think, I may be off on this, but I think there were some 7 members of cabinet who had worked as coal miners or in working class jobs. And that was one of the most successful governments in Britain's post-war history. And it was not dominated by people exclusively who had university diplomas. And so I think we forget this. We forget that not very long ago, it was part of representative government that people with working class backgrounds served as members of parliament in large numbers and in cabinets. And that is becoming increasingly rare today. And it's a symptom, I think, of the meritocratic orientation and the almost relentless emphasis in the allocation of jobs and social roles on having a university diploma. But this excludes roughly 2/3 of the populations of Britain, of America, and of many European countries.
I just want to ask you one further question about the victims and the ones who are sufferings, and you talk about it towards the end of your book. And we also had Anne Case and Angus Deaton speaking recently in this series about deaths of despair, and that's particularly about the white working class. So, do you want to just tell us a little bit about how that fits into to the argument before we move on to the democracy and politics?
Well, I write in the book about the demoralizing effect of the tyranny of merit on working people. And the demoralizing effect arises, first of all, from job losses over the last 4 decades as companies outsourced jobs to low-wage countries. That's a familiar story. Also, the wage stagnation that has been the result of this version of globalization. And this damages the prospects of working people in Britain, in the US, and throughout Europe in 2 ways. One is in strictly economic terms: diminished job prospects, stagnant wages. But it's more than an economic loss. It has to do with a loss of social recognition and esteem, the kind of respect that we accord people who are engaged in working class services and jobs. And these demoralizing effects, economic and also cultural, having to do with diminished social esteem, have deeply demoralized large swaths of the working class. And one measure of this is that many people have, especially working age men, have dropped out of the labor force. They're not even seeking jobs, so they don't even show up in the unemployment statistics. But another chilling expression of this development is what Case and Deacon have written about deaths of despair, which is the increase in deaths by alcohol, drug abuse, and suicide taken together. And they have found, as you heard when you spoke with them, an alarming increase in deaths of despair among this generation of working people, especially working men, but working people generally. And so this is one more indication of the dark side of meritocracy, because it's a measure of the deep demoralization that has come along with this relentless privileging of meritocratic elites and denigration, really, by the society of people who haven't been to college and don't work in prestigious professions.
One, Anne and Angus did say that they feared that the UK might be one country that will follow this. So this is something which we're looking at doing a lot of work on. I want to come on to the populist revolt and the political implications of this. And you mentioned how Michael Young had predicted this in his book, and we're living through that now with Trump and with Brexit and Boris Johnson and Brazil and all those other things that are happening in the former communist countries. And one of the things that is about leadership, and you talk very strongly about how even though we have these really well-educated politicians and elites supposedly running things, they just don't get it, do they? They don't understand what has been driving some of these things. They think it's about immigration, and they think it's about fears about technological change. But you point to things like about, a political failure of historic proportions.
Yes.
What is driving this?
Well, there's a tendency for governing elites of mainstream political parties to interpret the populist revolt as one of two things: either a hatred of immigrants, multiculturalism, and outsiders, racism, xenophobia. And there certainly is an element of that. Or they interpret it as the inability of working people to deal with the demands of the new global economy and of new technology. And when they explain the populist revolt in these ways, what they assume is that adapting to globalization and technology is simply a demand to adapt to forces that have simply come upon us, as if from nowhere, like the weather, nothing to do with us. But in fact, what working people rightly recognize is that the form globalization has taken and the uses that technology have been put to are the result of policies, choices that governing elites have made. What these two explanations miss, the one that emphasizes hatred of immigrants and xenophobia, and the one that says they're simply anxious about globalization and technology, they'd better get with it. What that misses is the responsibility that governing elites have for creating this condition, for embracing a version of neoliberal or market-driven globalization that involves outsourcing jobs to low-wage countries, devastating the job prospects of working people, telling working people the solution is to rise by getting a college degree, according greater and greater respect to those who have risen into professions through college degrees, disparaging those who aren't suited to that or don't have access to that. And so the inequalities and the attitudes, the disparaging attitudes toward those who have lost out, didn't just come from nowhere. They were a result of the way mainstream parties have governed over the last 40 years. But these mainstream political parties and politicians have been tone deaf, really, to the roiling resentment and anger and frustration of working people. They've also missed the culture of condescension that the professional classes, the mainstream politicians, the governing elites, have been implicated in. It's as if they haven't noticed that the inequalities brought about by their policies and the cultural disparagement of people who have not flourished in the new economy. It's as if they don't realize that it has something to do with them and the way they've been governing. That's the mistake of simply saying they're racist, xenophobic, and anti-immigrant, or they're simply anxious. They don't understand how to flourish. They don't understand how to rise. They haven't gotten a degree. It lets that way of interpreting it lets these elites off the hook, but it also makes them, it made them blind to the resentments that we're building and that now roil our politics and that have driven us apart. And so part of what I'm trying to do with the book, The Tyranny of Merit, is to speak to those governing elites who have missed this, who have not seen the dark side of the meritocracy and the rhetoric of rising that has been at the heart of their political argument. And to help us rethink the idea that the solution to inequality is simply telling people to go get a degree. And mind you, I'm all in favor of encouraging people to go to university. That's my life, teaching young people. But it's one thing to celebrate a university education for its own sake. And it's another thing to make a university education the only or the primary response to the inequality that this economy has brought about. That's the mistake.
When you talked about what we value in terms of people, and the contribution that a plumber or a dental hygienist could make just as much as anyone else who's got a college degree or whatever to civic discourse and civic debate. And I thought that I looked the compared what Obama talked about, who we had such hopes on these kind of things,
right,
to what Robert Kennedy talked about in that incredible speech he made just before he was assassinated. I'm a participant in its great public ventures. And that's what we seem to have lost. And we found that in Britain with the Brexit vote, the collapse of traditionally working class Labour seats, for example, went to the Conservatives.
Yes. Robert F. Kennedy is a hero of mine. And in retrospect, he understood this. He was not tone deaf in the way that many of his successor politicians were. And he understood the meaning of work, the dignity of work. He said, he once said, fellowship, community, shared patriotism, these essential values don't come simply by buying and consuming goods together. They come from dignified employment at decent pay. The kind of employment that enables us to say, I helped to build this country. I am a participant in its great public ventures. This way of thinking and speaking affirms the dignity of work. Unlike the tyranny of merit that says you too can escape, go to college. What you earn depends on what you can learn. This was the slogan, I call it the rhetoric of rising, of mainstream politicians, of the center left and the center right. What you earn depends on what you can learn. You can make it if you try. But the implication was, if you don't flourish in the new economy, if you don't make it, your failure is your fault. That's the implication. They missed the insult implicit in the meritocratic message they were offering those who struggled in the new economy. They missed the insult. But that insult was not lost on those who received it, on those who've struggled in the new economy, as the inequality has deepened. And eventually, by 2016, there was a revolt against this whole way of thinking about politics and aspiration and dealing with inequality. And so we need a new way of dealing with inequality. We can't just tell people, you're struggling, you'd better get a university diploma. Then let's talk. Then we'll get you into the professional classes. We need to affirm, politics of the common good must be one that affirms the dignity of work and that recognizes through pay and social esteem the importance of the contributions made by plumbers and nurses and dental hygienists. But more than that, by all those people we are relying now on during these lockdowns, during the pandemic, delivery workers, grocery store clerks, warehouse workers, home health care providers, lorry drivers. These are not the best paid or the most honored workers in our society. But now we are calling them essential workers. So what I'm hoping, Andrew, is that from this moment of crisis, we will begin to recognize the contributions to the common good made by the people we now call essential, orient our economy to accord them the respect and the pay that their contribution warrants.
This is a key moment, I think, in terms of where we are. I mean, we, in this country, you know, we would go out to our front doors on a Thursday night and applaud the key workers, as they're called here, and
right.
And the streets would join in with this, and it was quite a moving experience, really, that we all participated in. I just want to ask you a couple more things about what we do about this. And the first is about education, and I accept that this is predominantly on the United States example that you've given, but you talk about how, you know, trying to reduce the reliance on the standardized tests, also trying to eliminate the system where, you know, the legacy system that if you're an alumni you get advantages, if you're an athlete you get advantages, and critically if you're a donor you get advantages, and you propose various things around this, but you also talk about almost making the admissions process a lottery in terms of how people can join the college system, particularly the elite colleges.
Right. I should quickly add that what I propose, not quite tongue-in-cheek, but what I propose is a lottery of the qualified.
Yeah.
These universities, the ones that are the object of such fevered striving and that generate such anxiety among affluent families trying to prepare their children to compete for admission, they get far more applicants, qualified applicants, than they can possibly admit. Harvard and Stanford get more than 40,000 applicants for about 2,000 places. And most of them are qualified. So what I suggest is cull out those who are not qualified to flourish, to do well, not just to scrape by. Take out all those who could not do well and who could not contribute to the education of their classmates, who could not flourish. And then one would be left with, I don't know, say 25,000 or 30,000, perfectly well qualified. And instead of trying to make all kinds of fine distinctions, which are pretty difficult to do among 18-year-olds anyhow, fine predictions about who really will be the most brilliant of 4 years or 8 years or 40 years from now. And instead of giving advantages to the children of donors or to athletes, have a lottery among those qualified applicants. And this is what I've proposed in the book. I have a hunch that my classes would go just as well as they do now. And if I'm wrong about this, we could do an experiment, admit half the class through a lottery of the qualified and half in the usual way, and then see if there was a difference in performance in university and even, for that matter, over time after graduation. And I think that if, so part of my point in proposing the lottery is to deflate the intensity of the anxiety, but also to awaken students and their parents and the wider society to the role of luck that operates anyhow. Part of what's damaging to attitudes of a meritocratic system is the conviction that we make it on our own, that it's our own doing, whether we make a lot of money, win a prestigious position, or get into an elite university. We've done it on our own, thanks to our own striving, our own effort, our own ambition, our own talents. But of course, we don't ever really fully succeed on our own. This way of thinking leads us to forget the luck and good fortune and the help that eased our way. The parents, the teachers, the coaches, the wider society, the accidents of fate that contribute to success. So part of what I want to do by the lottery proposal is to remind and make vivid to those who get in and to those who don't get in the element of luck in this system as it operates even without a lottery. That's my main point in suggesting this, Andrew, to change the way we think about winning and succeeding.
And just one, and the book also goes into, it talks about possible taxation changes, things like that. But one final question for me is about how we renew the civic sphere. And you know, you talk about the kind of spaces we need where we can talk to each other again, understand the differences we have, but in a much better way than we've experienced recently. What's the kind of things we need to do here?
One of the most corrosive consequences of the deepening inequality of recent decades has been the hollowing out of public places and common spaces in neighborhoods, towns, cities. There are fewer and fewer occasions when people from different backgrounds, different classes, different ethnic and cultural backgrounds find themselves encountering one another in the course of everyday life. And this is a great loss. It happens in large part because in a market-driven society with deepening inequality, the affluent buy their way out of public services and public institutions, which become left for those who can't afford to buy their way out. Now, this is unfair to those who are left behind if the services wither in their quality and provision. But there is a further toll that it takes, this hollowing out of the public sphere. And that is less class mixing, less occasion to encounter one another, to bump up against one another in the course of our everyday lives. And this is deeply corrosive of the common good, because the common good understood in the civic way that I try to articulate in the book, common good understood in that way requires that we see ourselves as participants in a shared way of life, in common projects. And as the public sphere and as common spaces become hollowed out, we have less and less occasion to do that. And so part of reclaiming a politics of the common good means remaking the infrastructure of civic life, rebuilding those public and community centers and institutions in ways that bring people together, that mix classes and backgrounds, ethnic and cultural backgrounds, so that we can begin in the ordinary course of our lives to think of ourselves and to be citizens engaged in a shared way of life.
And that fulfills the American dream, as I read about in the book, in the original document that mentioned that, and the fulfilled life, not just about rising, but also about living a fulfilled life.
Yes, it's the person, I went back to the person who coined the phrase, the American dream. Because today we think about the American dream as all about rising, about upward mobility, about escaping one's past even. And he did talk, the person who coined this term did speak about everyone having an equal chance. But that wasn't all he meant. He also talked about public institutions that gather people together across racial and ethnic and class backgrounds. And he gave the example of the Library of Congress, which is a public library owned by all citizens. And he spoke about the joy, this was in the 1930s. He spoke about the joy of being in the public reading room with young and old, rich and poor, black and white, people of every ethnicity, reading, learning in a common space provided by the public resources. He saw this as essential to democracy and to the American dream, which of course is not only an American dream understood in this more expansive civic way. It's, I think, a dream at the heart of democracy everywhere. It's not unique to the American conception of democracy. But what it suggests is that democracy requires more than the trappings of elections and voting and parliaments. Really, to redeem the democratic ideal is to create a certain kind of civil society that partakes of a certain equality of condition. And by equality of condition, and I describe this in the book, I don't mean equal income and wealth for everyone. Beyond a certain point, extreme differences of income and wealth are corrosive of the common good. But what's required for a kind of civil society that can sustain democracy is a sufficient equality of condition such that people encounter one another across class lines in public places and institutions. Libraries, community centers, municipal centers, health clinics, public transit, museums, coming together. And that's what we've lost as we've privatized and marketized really the fabric of civil society. That's antithetical to the common good. That contributes to the polarization that we see in politics and that we bemoan. We can't solve that polarization simply by electing different politicians who will be less rancorous and more civil to one another, because it goes beyond decorum, it goes beyond manners, it goes to really the fabric of the civil society, the moral and civic fabric of everyday life. And so that is what seems to me is the necessary path to a politics of the common good. Not agreement on everything, not consensus on everything, but enough of a shared way of life embodied in common spaces and public institutions so that we can begin to think of ourselves as democratic citizens again.
Thank you very much, Michael. The Tyranny of Merit, What's Become of the Common Good, is published by Alan Lane and is available from our partners, Waterstones Online, and available in all bookshops across the country. It's an essential book for our times. It's one that we will encourage very wide reading and debate on. We're very grateful to you, Michael, for joining us today. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for listening in.